Hello, global gardeners. Happy Monday. I foresee a wonderful gardening week ahead for all of us, and it's beginning right here. The weather is finally improving to the point that I can get outside every day and work in the garden. It's been a long time since I've had that opportunity. Today, I'm going to be focusing primarily on soil and how to build a good soil in your garden, how to maintain the soil in your garden. And it really comes down to what we're providing for our plants. Too often, gardeners focus on the plants. Are the plants growing well? Are the plants producing what we expect the plants to produce? And really, that's kind of misdirected in the way that we approach our garden. If we only look at the plants, then we are kind of dealing with the symptoms and we may not even know what the problem is. If we look at the soil and build a good, healthy soil, then our plants will do fine. They'll do well. They'll do great. And we may not have to worry about what's going wrong with our plants. There are no symptoms to worry about because it all comes down to the soil. So by focusing on the soil, it really makes the whole gardening journey so much easier in relation to what our plants are doing and what efforts we put into our garden as related to the plants. Shout out to so many people today. It's nice to see Rick here, of course, giving up his sleep to be with us. That's always so welcome. Shout out to Milltown Life, a new member of the Gardner Scott community. Appreciate that. And for those of you at the training and collaborator level, there will be a members only live stream after this one, shortly after. So stick around for that. Be sure and throw out your questions about soil and everything else, because so many of us are right in the beginning of our season. Even for those of you on the other side of the planet, like Rick, that are at the end of your season, there's still so many things to be thinking about and preparing and planning, and we can help you out with all of that today. Jay and Heidi, so nice to see you both back, and I do hope that you are doing well, Jay. When we look at the soil, and this is a photo of my garden that I have behind me that I took this morning. I've been working on my beds for the last couple of weeks, getting them all ready to go, raking them, taking out any weeds, moving mulches. I think the soil temperature is a very important aspect in the success of your garden. We'll be talking a lot more about the nutrients and the development and the maintenance of a garden. But when we first put our plants out, the temperature is a big deal. And it's just this week that my soil temperature has reached 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 15 Celsius. Below that, many of the plants that we would be growing in our garden really won't do well. If you put tomatoes, peppers, squash, melons, all those heat-loving plants into your garden in soil that is colder than 60F or 15C, they're not going to start off well. They could very well be stunted, and it could affect how they grow for the rest of the season. So here in Colorado, it's cold, it stays cold, and then suddenly it warms up very quickly. So this week, my temperatures are finally right to start growing. When I talk about the symptoms that you may be seeing in your plants, if your plants just aren't doing that well, if they're struggling, if there's too many leaves that are yellow, if they're just not growing as quickly as you're used to, measure the soil temperature and think about when it was that you put those plants into the ground. If you put them in too early, even if it's sunny outside, even if the air temperature is warm, if the soil is still cold, it can affect your entire growing season. So it's hard. Gardeners have to have patience. But by waiting that extra week or two, maybe even 3, you can often have much better success over the course of the growing season. Gardens Happen says, I went for like an hour and a half on compost for compost day. Awesome. Yeah, I've been adding a lot to my compost pile as I deal with the weeds and cut the grasses. And my neighbor has given me bags and bags of good material for the compost. So let's go ahead and start there, because that is one of those things that I want to talk about when we are dealing with soil. Compost. If you ask an experienced gardener what the solution is to good soil, compost is almost invariably going to be the answer. But it goes beyond that. It's more than just compost. It's actually a much larger subject than that. So, pop quiz, going to throw a question out to you. Let's see if anyone can get the answer. And it sounds simple, and you may already know this. Two things. What are the two things that you need to build a good soil? And if you account for these two things, your soil will get better. Your plants will improve and grow better than they ever have before. And it's more than just compost. So that's not one of the answers, but it's close. It's a hint. What are the two things that you think we need? And of course, I'll be giving you the answer, but I just want to see what your guesses might be and see if somebody might have an idea. So Shandy's Garden is saying organic matter and water. And so, yes, those are both good things, but it's not the two specifically that we really need to be thinking about. And let's see, Lisa's saying organic matter and water. Milltown Life is saying organic matter and drainage. Brian's Garden is saying biology and organic matter. Those are all great answers. Heidi says organic matter producing and microbes, also good. Mel R, moisture holding and drainage, good. And Boothby Gardens has hit on the other half of it, patience and determination. So I break it down into organic matter and time. The water is an important factor, but you can have good soil even if it's too dry, and you can have good soil even if it's too wet. The biology of the soil and the microbes, absolutely. They will come if you have the food, and that's what the organic matter is. If you have the food in the soil, the microbes will find it. You really don't need to make much effort to introduce anything. You don't have to buy the mycorrhiza in bags and introduce it. The spores for the fungi are all around us. It's the same with the bacteria. If you have organic matter in your soil, it's going to have bacteria on it. Even if you buy sterilized bags, by the time you open up the bag and put it into your soil, bacteria will have found that organic matter and will begin breaking it down. It's the time component that I think we too often forget about or we don't recognize. And whether you call it patience and determination or just a more generic time, it takes a while to build good soil. If you add compost to your garden this year, if you have a brand new garden with brand new beds, brand new soil, and you add compost to that soil, it's really going to have minimal impact on your plants. In fact, I've seen this. It's happened to me. I've had many people ask about it, saying, I had new beds, I added compost, and my plants aren't doing well at all. It's because it takes time for those microbes to populate the soil, to begin feeding on that organic matter, and for the nutrients to become available to the plants. And that, I think, is the most important aspect of this time component. When we talk organic matter, it isn't automatically a panacea. It's not a great fertilizer for the plants. It doesn't improve our beds immediately. I've been trying to think of an analogy as to how the organic matter works in our soil. And I think I have one that might help you visualize this idea of time versus organic matter. You've seen the tips: bury a banana peel, bury eggshells, bury a fish. You put all of this material into the soil. All of that is organic material, and it's going to make your plants grow better. Without the time aspect, that's not the case. So let's say that we want to go on a hamburger diet. Many of us like hamburgers. Many of us eat hamburgers, and you want to have a hamburger diet. You may have seen the, the documentary of a number of years back, Super Size Me, about eating at McDonald's every day and the health aspects of eating hamburgers. I won't go into that. But if you were to choose a hamburger diet and say, okay, now it's time for me to move forward with this diet, and a farmer brings a cow into your backyard and says, here, this is for your hamburger diet. Now, what can you do with a cow when it comes to your diet? Well, there are many steps involved. First off, you have to take care of the cow. Sorry, you got to kill it. Well, let's bring this back to the soil. Anytime we're putting that organic matter in the soil, that step is usually taken care of. It's dead plant material. Okay, first step is done. Second step, well, we've got to take the hide off of that cow. Happens in the soil as well. All that organic matter typically has a shell, a skin. It has some protective covering that needs to be broken down to even access all of the material inside that organic matter. If it's grass, if it's leaves, if it's eggshells, if it's a banana peel, the outer layer is the first that needs to be broken down and the first that needs to be dealt with. So now we've got a cow that's been skinned. We're still not able to eat any of that meat. We now need to butcher it. We need to break it down into smaller pieces. That's what's happening in the soil as well. It's not the bacteria that is doing that. We think of a good, rich soil as being filled with bacteria, and it's also filled with fungi. But that's not enough to break down the organic matter into the smaller pieces that the bacteria are actually going to feed upon. This is where the arthropods and the earthworms and many other soil insects come into play. We talk about the mealybugs and the centipedes. Those are the kind of bugs that people often think are detrimental in their garden, but they're breaking down the organic matter into much smaller pieces. So we've got our cow, we've butchered it. Now we've got big chunks of meat. We still can't eat those big chunks of meat, even when it's broken down into smaller portions. We humans, our bodies, our stomach need it in much smaller pieces before we can even begin to add it to our diet. So, in the case of a hamburger, we're going to take that meat and we're going to grind it into those smaller pieces so that we can make our hamburger patties. It's working the same way in the soil with all those organisms continuing to break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. Finally, when we get to the point that we've got a hamburger patty that we can cook up and start eating, it's not done yet. In the soil, we finally reach the point where we have those pieces of organic matter broken down into really small particles in the soil and in our gut. The same thing happens. It's bacteria. When those particles are finally small enough that the bacteria can begin the decomposition, the breakdown, that's when we can finally begin to get some of the nutrients. And it's only at that point that the nutrients are released so that the plant or the human can access the in our case, consider it the vitamins. In the case of plants, consider it elements. But only after all of those steps can we finally get to the point where the nutrients are available. That takes time. Whether it's dry or wet, it's still going to happen. A moist soil is going to happen quicker. Our wet gut, even with all of the acids in it, is the same idea. The bacteria that's breaking down all this material needs some very specific environments to do best. Water is a component of that. Oxygen is a component of that. Nitrogen is a component of that. But time is what makes the difference. So if you put compost in your soil this spring, it may not be available for your plants to use as nutrients until the end of this year, probably more likely next year. So it takes a year or 2 or 5 before you can reach the point that your soil has finally been populated with billions and billions of microbes and all the fungi and all of those beneficial soil insects. And the nutrients are there in your soil, ready for the plants. So let's go ahead and get to some questions. Big Will Dog is saying, this is why I preload my compost pile with nutrients during the year. It's breaking down, and then fertilize the compost in bed and wait 2 weeks to plant into it. Exactly. Exactly. And I've talked about this many, many times before. And this is my basic approach as well. So I prefer to add the compost and other organic materials, because I'll also use straw and grass and crushed leaves. And I do that the year before I plan to be growing in that bed. Generally, it's at the end of the season. As fall approaches, I amend my beds, and then I've got all of the fall and all of the winter and all the spring for all that material to break down for my plants to use. And my beds will dry out, but when they get wet again, the bacteria jumps to life. My beds will freeze, and when it gets warm again, the bacteria and the fungi will jump to life. So because of that time component, I agree. I preload it from the year before that it's breaking down. And then as far as the fertilizing, 2 weeks, I would say is a minimum. I prefer when I add compost in the spring, I'd like to give it at least 4 weeks if I can. That's what I've done with most of my beds this year. Even though the soil was cool, I was able to add compost, new loads of compost. But that was an extra. That was a supplement to all the compost that I added last year. And so the idea is it's not a one and done. You can just amend your beds once a year, and that it will probably be adequate. And over a course of years, your soil will be nice and rich and your plants will do great. If you supplement it, if you do your big amending in fall, and then you do a supplemental feeding of compost in spring, well, all those nutrients that were broken down and available from the year before are going to be used by the plants in the first month and the second month and the third month of growth. Well, by the time that the fourth and fifth month comes along, those plants are still looking for nutrients. That's where that compost that you've put in the spring and given some time to incorporate into the soil, now you're giving that second feeding of nutrients over the course of the growing season. I rarely use fertilizer in my garden after the soil has been developed. For new beds, because of that time factor, because it takes a while, I will add nutrients in the springtime because the plants are looking for those nutrients. They need the nutrients to grow, and my soil is not ready to provide all the nutrients. But by the time you hit the 3-year point, 4-year point, you should be able to eliminate fertilizers from your garden if you're following this sustained process of improving the soil. Serena's saying, I got my first green stock and filled it with Members Mark potting mix in the 5-tier. 2 bags wasn't quite enough, so I mixed 2 5-gallon buckets, 1/3 each of vermiculite and peat moss. That will work. And so let's talk a little bit about container gardening, and be it a green stock or a 5-gallon bucket or a big pot. When you put a mix in it, so like in this case, talking about vermiculite and peat moss, vermiculite is great for drainage. Peat moss is great for holding moisture. Both very important things when we talk about our soil structure. How well does it drain and how well does it hold water? But vermiculite and peat moss have no nutrients. So whenever I'm making my own mix, I always add compost as a source of nutrients. And if you look at many of my videos where I talk about making my own soil, I will also add a, a source of nutrients that's a little faster acting than compost, because compost is decomposed or mostly decomposed organic matter. So the nutrients are there. They still need to be pulled out of that compost by the soil bacteria, and that takes time. So by adding a fertilizer to your potting mix, to your containers, you can really help ensure that the plants are getting the nutrients that they need. Even if it's a bagged potting mix that says it has the fertilizers in it, take another step to try to recognize what kind of fertilizer it is. If it is a slow release fertilizer, it's going to take time. Slow release means that it is dependent on time for those nutrients to become available. So you may need a water soluble fertilizer early in the season when you're using potting mixes. Even if you've got a raised bed or an in-ground bed that you have added organic matter to, you may need a fertilizer that is immediately available to the plant. Water soluble fertilizers are that type. Then allow the time for the slow release fertilizers to release the nutrients. And I think many gardeners over fertilize. If you fertilize, generally, you only need to do it once early in the season because of that time component. By the time those plants are growing, now those organic materials in the soil have released the materials because they've been broken down by all the soil life, and the plants will do well and can keep growing. Rudimental gardening is saying, keep in mind, other than compost, any organic material needs a considerable amount of time to break down. For quick fixes for nutrient deficiencies, use water-soluble fertilizers. Oh yeah, that's just what I said. And so that's one of those things, and I talk about it, and I've got a couple myth videos. Banana peels are a perfect example. You can't put a banana peel in your garden underneath any plant and expect that it's going to have any impact on that plant in that growing season. It's going to take a lot of time to break down. If you put eggshells in the garden, it's going to take years for those eggshells to even begin to be broken down. And now when we talk about the soil and the nutrients, just because an eggshell has calcium in it doesn't mean that's the same type of calcium, or that it's calcium in a form that plants can use. And so I don't like these quick fixes that you're going to bury something and it's going to make a difference in your garden, because it just doesn't work that way. It takes time. If you need that quick fix, the water soluble fertilizer, as I said, and as the rudimental gardening said as well, that is absolutely the solution to it. The biggest consideration when we talk about the nutrients in our soil is the nitrogen. Now, you know about NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but do you know about sulfur and magnesium and calcium? Those are macronutrients that plants need as well. And so when we're fertilizing our garden Too often we're focused on the NPK. It's much more than that. Plants need so many more nutrients. And so by adding an EPK fertilizer, yes, those are the primary of the 6 macronutrients that plants are going to need. And the plants will grow better if they have more of those nutrients. But it still may not be enough. The soil, when you're using any type of organic matter, and I make my own compost. I encourage you do too. So in just the last week, I've added banana peels, watermelon rinds, spinach, lettuce, apple cores, and so many different kinds of weeds I can't even begin to tell you into my compost pile. And so I've called it my combination pizza in the past. My compost pile is made up of dozens of different types of organic material. All of that organic material have different ratios of different nutrients. When they're broken down into my compost and then the compost is put into my soil, all of those different nutrients are now in my soil for the plants to use. And plants need molybdenum. They need copper. They need iron. They need a lot of micronutrients in addition to the macronutrients. And trying to find a fertilizer that has all of the macronutrients is difficult. I have a link below to IV Organic. One of the reasons I like the IV Organic fertilizer is because it has all 6 of the primary macronutrients. And you don't find that very often. So I don't fertilize often, but when I do fertilize, I prefer to fertilize with something like IV Organic that has more than just the NPK. Over time, by adding all of those different organic materials and allowing them to break down, my soil has everything that the plants need. And you can achieve the same thing. Leaves, the dried leaves that fall from trees, will have minerals that you won't find in the kitchen waste that you throw into your compost. So that's why I like adding crushed leaves to my soil, because they're adding different nutrients, different minerals that I can't get from my compost that's based on the soft green plants that go into it. So lots of different stuff. And if it's a plant, if it died, you can put it into your compost or into your soil. And with time, it's going to benefit the diversity. I see Brian's Garden saying diversity in compost and worm food not only adds different nutrients, but also different types of biology. Absolutely. It's that diversity that we are adding to our garden that really makes the difference. I tried doing an experiment. It didn't work out as well as I had anticipated, but I was going to make compost with just cardboard and then try to do some experiments with a compost of a cardboard only compost compared to a compost that had the diversity of organic materials. The cardboard I expected would begin breaking down at about 6 months, and I tried to make it like leaf mold and expected in a year or so it would be broken down enough that I could begin using it, and it didn't work as I had hoped. So the idea being that if you have a compost with just a single material like cardboard or any other single material that you might be using to make compost, it's still organic. It's still going to retain water. It's still going to provide nutrients to the plants, but it's going to be very limited. It's just a very small part of the spectrum when it comes to the nutrients that one material is going to provide when it breaks down. When you throw in everything else, that whole combination pizza into your soil, now you can rest assured that your plants are going to get the nutrients that they're looking for. And that is an important factor. Outlier Gardener, thank you for that super sticker. I appreciate it. It's always nice to have you here, and I appreciate your participation and the contribution. That's so much. Thank you. And we'll get to your question. Is it possible to review bagged potting soil that was improperly stored? If so, how? I opened a few that smelled off and it would be a shame to waste it. Okay, good question. And so let's talk about the smell. So when I say it's the bacteria that are breaking down the organic material, the bacteria are really broken down into two different categories. We've got aerobic bacteria and we have anaerobic bacteria. And so in our compost pile, in the soil, most of the soils, it's going to be the aerobic bacteria that are doing that final decomposition. And it's aerobic because they need oxygen. So when we have a good loose soil, has a lot of oxygen, all of those insects and all that bacteria can thrive and break down the material and make those nutrients available to the plant. In an environment where we don't have the oxygen, we still have the bacteria, but it's an anaerobic bacteria. It's a bacteria that does not need oxygen. In fact, they die when they are in an environment that's filled with oxygen. So in a bag of any material, that organic compost, organic topsoil, organic potting soil, if it's bagged and it's been sitting for a while and there's moisture in it, because the bacteria will need some moisture to survive, it will still be filled with bacteria. It's just anaerobic bacteria. One of the things that you can tell when it's anaerobic bacteria is because of the smell. The anaerobic bacteria makes it smell bad. That's not a bad thing. You can still use material that has been decomposed by anaerobic bacteria in your soil. When you put it in your soil, an aerobic environment, it's going to kill all the anaerobic bacteria, but all those nutrients are still there. The plant doesn't care whether it was decomposed by aerobic bacteria or anaerobic bacteria. When the bacteria breaks it down and releases the nutrients have been released, regardless of what type of bacteria actually completed the process. So while it may not feel right or smell right, I wouldn't be too concerned about the potting soil that just happens to smell bad. Open it up, let it air out for a day or two, and the anaerobic bacteria will die, the smell will go away, and then you can use it as you were planning to use it, with the realization that it probably actually is richer. It's more or full of more of the nutrients than before the bacteria actually got to work and were able to break it down. So no, you don't need to waste it at all. If you're at all concerned, especially if it's still chunky or you don't like the texture of it, you can mix it into your soil. You can add it to your compost pile, and you won't even notice the difference from a bag that wasn't stored the same way and that doesn't have the same smell. It's all organic material. And that's really the key when we're dealing, whether it's something that we save ourselves, like my neighbor this week. I got a bag of leaves, I got a bag of pine needles, I got 4 bags of grass clippings mixed with leaves as he was cleaning up his lawn to start the season. All of that is good organic matter that my neighbor gave to me. I save my own weeds for the compost pile, my own leaves when I get them, but it's free. When you pay for it, when you have to go to the store and buy a potting mix or a compost or whatever it happens to be, it's not a source that you know the where it came from, like my neighbor or myself, but it's still organic matter. It's still material that can be used in your garden, and that's the key difference. Not all of us have that option of using free materials, and it's okay to purchase what you need in the garden. It's all organic. The stuff you buy tends to be chunkier. It tends to be mixed a lot with forest products. When you look at the bag, be sure and read the label, and it'll tell you what's in the bag. And forest products, which basically means cut up bark and trees, That is a big part of it because it's cheap, it fills the bag, but it's chunky. And so if you're talking about this time component again, it's organic matter. It's what the soil needs. But when we add a bagged potting mix, especially when it's been filled with forest products, not only is it going to take time, but it's going to take more time than if it was compost that had been made from green plant material, the soft plant material. So when you throw the lettuce and the banana peels and the scraps from your kitchen into your compost pile, and you add grass clippings, and you throw in all the thinnings from your garden beds, all of that is typically soft green material. It breaks down very quickly. And that compost can be used in very little time if you're actively turning the pile and have a hot compost pile. If you're using the bagged material that's chunky with pieces of wood in it, it's going to take many months, maybe even years, for those wood pieces to break down because it's more than the bacteria that is decomposing the wood. The fungi is really important to break down the woody materials in beds. And many of our garden beds don't have the fungus that we need to break down the wood that comes from a bag that we buy. So time is a critical component. And even the compost, the mushroom compost bags that I will buy to add to my garden beds have big chunky pieces of wood in it. And I'll put that compost into my beds in fall. And in spring, when I come back to my bed to get ready for planting, there are still pieces of that wood. It takes too long to break down. So by doing this every year on a regular basis, eventually those wood pieces from 3 years ago have broken down and released the nutrients to the soil. Be aware of that when you choose the organic matter. And that's why the mix and the variety is so important, because not only are they releasing different nutrients, but they're releasing those nutrients at different times in the decomposition process. Rick is saying, I add in lots of fruit shop waste and or carrot rind for the juice from the juice bar or for the juice bar horse manure into my compost. Yeah, yeah, and in fact, that's one reason I like the idea of using manures, especially if it's a manure from a horse that you know what it was fed, because the horse is one of those decomposition animals. Instead of it being of that organic matter being decomposed in our soil, it's being partially decomposed in the horse's stomach. And so when it comes out as manure, it has been broken down beyond its original raw state. And so, yeah, fruit shop waste, again, those soft materials that are going to be broken down very quickly. And then the horse manure as well, it's also going to break down faster in the soil because it's been mostly decomposed already by the animal. Shannon McGinnis is asking, how necessary is it to check the temperature of the compost on a regular basis? Should I do it regularly? What temp should it be? So it depends on what kind of compost you're making. There are, and I've got a video on this, no doubt Jay is gonna find the video. There are different type of bacteria in a compost pile. There are three basic types, and they operate at different temperatures. So the importance of monitoring your compost pile is to identify which type of bacteria are most active at that point in time, because they're going to be different bacteria when the pile is still cold to do that initial decomposition of the material. There's a different bacteria as the pile begins heating up, because one of the byproducts of the decomposition process is heat. And then the thermophilic bacteria, the bacteria that are operating at very high temperatures, are the final phase, and they're producing a ton of heat. They're also breaking down the material very, very efficiently and quickly. And so one of the numbers to be aware of is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 60 degrees Celsius. When you hit that point, that's when the thermophilic bacteria is most active. And so it can happen fast, and the temperature can climb very, very quickly. So when the thermophilic bacteria are active in your pile, you can expect the temperature to get up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 Celsius. Yes, your compost pile can get that hot. When it gets above that point, it's now too hot, and the bacteria will start dying. And so the importance of checking the compost on a regular basis is to see if your pile is heating up, and if it's at the point where it's breaking down very, very quickly, and is it too hot and you need to do something about it. Now, the fixes for almost all of these is to turn the pile to add oxygen to make sure that it's moist enough, because this is the case where the moisture does make a difference so the bacteria can thrive. And it's a question of the food. So if you've got the proper mix of the nitrogens and the carbons, the greens and the browns in your pile to start with, then monitoring the pile will help you determine whether you need to turn the pile, whether you need to water the pile, or whether you can recognize that maybe the pile is too brown, because adding more nitrogen is another good fix to get the compost pile started. So I worked with a guy a number of years ago who was fanatical about his compost, and he would measure twice a day. He would measure before he went to work to determine if he needed to add water or to turn the pile. And then he would measure when he got home to see if his actions from the morning were enough or if he needed to do something in the afternoon. When you take that much effort, you can start with raw material, raw kitchen scraps, raw plants, raw grass clippings, and you can have completely finished compost within a month. It's work, but it can be done. I do lazy composting, cold composting, where I'll just stick it in a big pile, keep it moist, turn it occasionally, and I get compost in 5 or 6 months. And I'm occasionally monitoring the temperature just to see if it's in that middle range of bacterial growth, but I'm not doing the hot pile. I've got too much to do in the garden to focus on my compost. So I take it at a much slower pace. But those are a couple ways you can do it when it comes to the temperature that the pile is at. And so the nitrogen is really an important factor when we talk about the soil life and how it's breaking down. Nitrogen is needed by the bacteria. Nitrogen is needed by the fungi. Nitrogen is needed by the plants. Basically, everything that's growing in our soil needs nitrogen, which means that of all of the nutrients that are available in our garden, nitrogen is often the lowest because it's being used by everything. And so be aware of that. That's one reason why it's a nice idea to add compost on at a couple different times of year, because the compost will have nitrogen, even though the bacteria have consumed a lot of the nitrogen. There's still nitrogen available in the compost. And when you put it in the soil, it's going to be available for your plants, but it's also going to be used by the soil life. So amending a few times during the year, if you begin to see the possibility of a nitrogen deficiency in your plants, that's one fix, is just upping how often you amend. The other option, and this is the quick fix that most gardeners take, is to fertilize with a high nitrogen fertilizer when you recognize that you have a nitrogen deficiency. The problem is, because so many people use a high nitrogen fertilizer in their garden, is it's not always the best answer. If there's enough nitrogen in your soil and you add more, the plants are going to use it. The soil life are going to use it. Plants use nitrogen to grow, to be green, to send out the leaves and the stems and grow more leaves and stems and more leaves and stems. It's like a kid at the county fair with the cotton candy. You just eat the cotton candy and you want more cotton candy. That's all you're thinking about. You're not thinking about anything else but riding the rides and having a wonderful day and eating cotton candy. It isn't until after the fair is done and you're at home that it's like, oh, wow, I didn't eat lunch. I didn't eat dinner. I didn't even think about anything else. All I did was ride rides and eat cotton candy. That's the way the plants are. They're just growing and growing and growing and just going and going and going. And they don't think about things like flowers and fruit. And if you have beautiful, big, green plants and no flowers or fruit, that's an indication that you probably have too much nitrogen in your soil. And so if you're a fertilizer, don't be a fertilizer as a gardener. Go ahead and let your soil give the nitrogen that the plants need. And it's likely to be deficient, but there's big chance that there's enough nitrogen there for your plants if you've been doing regular amending. You can, and I highly encourage, I gardened for 25 years before I did my first soil test. Once I started doing soil testing, I recognized I was about 20 years late in doing my soil testing. Soil tests can give you a really good idea of the nutrient levels within your soil. They'll give you a nitrogen, a phosphorus, and potassium. In many cases, more and more of the labs are not providing a nitrogen analysis on your soil, and there's good reason for that. Nitrogen in our soil is only there for a brief period. It will leach out of the soil. So if you have a heavy rainfall, if you do a lot of watering, the nitrogen in your soil can leach out and go into the groundwater, go into your lakes and lagoons and rivers. The nitrogen is gone. So not only is it being used by all your plants, but it can dissipate quite quickly. That's not the case with most of the other nutrients. So if you do a soil test and you find out that your nitrogen is low, that's normal. But your phosphorus and potassium and your copper and your calcium and your manganese and everything else that's in that soil test are good. Now, when you choose to fertilize, you don't need a balanced fertilizer. You don't need a fertilizer with all the extra stuff. You don't need to put Epsom salts in your garden soil. Probably the only thing you need to be concerned with is nitrogen. And adding organic matter to your soil will help keep the nitrogen levels high. When we talk about nitrogen, we've got different types of nitrogen that the plants are using. Nitrates are an important thing when we look at the nitrogen in our soil. Ammonium is an important type of nitrogen when we look at the nitrogen in our soil. And so again, that's a big reason why the labs are beginning to not test the nitrogen as much, because there's different types of nitrogen. It may be a good type. If you've got the nitrate and the ammonium in your soil, it's not leaching out like it would if you were using a water-soluble nitrogen fertilizer. Well, the ammonium, the nitrate, the nitrite, that all comes from the organic matter in your soil. So a soil that is rich with organic matter can retain the nitrogen better than a soil that doesn't have organic matter and is being fertilized with a water-soluble fertilizer. So if your soil isn't healthy, if it doesn't have that organic matter, and you fertilize it with a water-soluble fertilizer, it's a quick fix. And you're going to have to fertilize it again and fertilize it again. And that's why so many of these fertilizer packages, when you read the directions, will say fertilize every 2 weeks or fertilize once a month. It's because of the assumption that you don't have a good soil and that you need to fertilize that much to keep your soil healthy. If your soil is healthy, again, with the organic matter and the time that you allow for your soil to become healthy, then you don't need to fertilize. And you certainly don't need to fertilize every 2 weeks because the soil is happy and the soil is taking care of everything that really needs to be taken care of. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and scroll up, see what kind of things that you've been saying. A lot of good chat back and forth. Rick is saying, quick compost must. Turn many times to mix the pile to ensure all parts have been heated to 140 F, including air to kill off the pathogens. And so that's a good point, Rick. Thank you for bringing that up. I don't often talk about that. So for the most part, when we have a compost pile and it's breaking down and it's reaching 140 Fahrenheit, 60 Celsius, that is the focus on the bacteria and the actual decomposition to ensure that weed seeds are killed and that pathogens are killed and even diseases that are on your plants. If you can have a sustained temperature, and sustained meaning multiple days above that 140 degree Fahrenheit threshold, you can kill off the pathogens. You can kill the weed seeds. You can kill the diseases that might be on those plants. So that's a big reason why you would want to do hot composting. Now, I, knock on wood, partly because my soil is so good and my plants are so healthy, I have very little disease in my garden. So I'm composting pretty much everything. And so I'm not worried about killing pathogens and diseases in my compost pile because I know the material I'm putting into my compost pile is disease-free. But if you're not sure, or if you've had issues with disease in your garden, then a hot compost pile is definitely something you should think about. And as Rick says, turning it regularly, that oxygen is really a big need of the bacteria to operate at that high temperature. Turning the pile, introducing oxygen as part of the turning, and keeping your bacteria nice and healthy will make a huge difference in the success of your compost. And then, of course, when you put it into the garden and the soil. Karen at A Garden for All Seasons says, we've had a ton of rain in Dallas. Oh, you guys have been slammed by rain. Well, worm castings help with replacing lost nutrients. So yes, worm castings are great. I like adding worm castings to my potting mixes. I like, if I have extra, adding worm castings into my garden beds. I typically don't have that much. But I'm more focused on adding the worm castings because of the bacteria. Like we talked about earlier, having the diversity, all the different types of bacteria and fungi that are going to be in the soil. And the worm castings add a lot of that bacteria diversity when we add it to our soil, either through the potting mix or directly into the soil. It does have nutrients, and it actually has a number of those micronutrients that you won't find in a bag of NPK fertilizer. The nitrogen is very, very small, typically 1% or less in worm castings. So while worm castings do have a nitrogen component, it isn't necessarily a good replacer of nitrogen. I look at it as a really nice amendment. It is boosting the level of the nitrogen. It is also boosting the level of some of those other micronutrients. And I think more importantly, it's boosting the levels of the bacteria that are needed within the soil for making them available in a usable form for plants. And that's really the key, a usable form. Just because the nutrients are in the soil doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the appropriate form that the roots can actually absorb. But if you've got worm castings, by all means, add them to your soil. There's very little, I'm not aware of any detrimental aspect of adding worm castings to your soil. And so do it not as a sole replacer of nutrients, but as a supplement, like I was talking about earlier, to the nutrients in the soil. And it really can help and make a big difference over time. And as you look at the time, what's our journey? How much time are you expecting on your gardener journey to get your garden where you want it to be? This is my 5th year, entering the 5th year at this house and my garden. And this is, like I said, the picture that I took this morning. If you go back to my videos from 5 years ago, you'll see that there was nothing here in my backyard. Nothing, literally nothing. Just a big open prairie, and everything has been added over 5 years. And so for me, as I am entering my 5th year of my 5-year plan for building, and I've got my gazebo and I've got my greenhouse and I've got my beds and I've got my wood chip mulch all over the place, it seems like it just happened overnight, but it's taken 5 years. I did a video last year where I did a soil test in one of my beds, the middle bed, and it actually was very, very high in the nutrients that I wanted for my plants. It was a little too high in some and wasn't quite as high as I would have liked in others, but it was better than it had been before. And that was at about the 3-year point. I think to really get into the whole soil building, become a soil nerd, test it regularly. I've got a link to the RX soil kits. It's one of the easiest ways that you can test your soil is you go online, they send you a box. Inside the box is a bag. You fill the bag with soil, and then you send the box back. The box is already postage paid. And then they'll send you an email that tells you when the report is done. You go online and you get the analysis of your soil. It's one of those easy ways to periodically see if what you're doing is working in your garden. You can assume in the first year, your soil isn't going to be good enough. Even if you buy what is being sold as garden soil, or you go to a big lot and get soil in bulk, and that's what I typically do to get a head start in my beds, it's still not going to be good, rich soil populated by soil life with nutrients available for the plants immediately. The first year can be good, but it's not going to be great. My best year so far was last year. The best year before that one was the year before. As your soil gets better, each year will be better. And at some point, you can actually take a break. I've mentioned One Yard Revolution as one of my favorite channels, and he hasn't made videos in years, but there's still lots of good videos on that channel. One of his videos, kind of like what I did last year with the test of mine, he was noticing that his plants were not doing as well after about 5 years, that they were doing better, each year was better, and then suddenly they weren't better. And he did the soil analysis and found out that his soil was too rich. You can actually have too many nutrients in the soil because the plant can only take up so many nutrients through the roots. And some of those nutrients are actually taken up by the plant easier and quicker. And so if those nutrients are more prevalent in the soil, the plant's going to take more of those nutrients. Magnesium is often one that you can have a surplus, too much of it in the soil. And if you have too much of it, it will actually block some of those other nutrients from getting into your plant. And so you might have a calcium deficiency, not because you've got too little calcium in the soil. Adding eggshells isn't going to help. It's because you've got too much magnesium or some of those other nutrients that are going to block the uptake of calcium. And so be aware of that amending and amending and amending, you can overdo it. So generally, if you're doing it pretty regularly at about the 5-year point, take a year off. Don't amend, grow your plants, let the plants use the nutrients in the soil, and then start the clock again the next year. And you might be able to get on a cycle where you only need to amend every 2 out of 3 years. It's going to take some time. I'm not there yet, but that's one of those things that you can figure out when you're doing regular soil testing. You spend a few dollars, you get your soil test done, you recognize that it's good, so that year you take it off. You don't need to add all the compost, and then you start up the next year. So many things along those lines that we can look at when we are discussing how we improve the soil. It can be too good. I know that's kind of crazy, but it can be filled with too many nutrients. And your plants aren't going to tell you, except when they suddenly start suffering. And it can be so many things that cause our plants to be stunted, to turn yellow, to not produce the fruit that we're expecting. Ultimately, the soil is probably the answer. The soil is not good enough, or in this case, maybe it's too good. CJ Don is saying, I'm at the 5-year mark and I finally feel like I'm having success in the garden. So that's fantastic. And I didn't see the second half of your comment, but I'm guessing it's because of all that work that you've been putting into the soil. Gina McGregor's saying, I'm a huge fan of chop and drop to improve soil. It has transformed my landscape areas to just prune in place. Plus, it fits my lazy gardening ethos. Oh, I completely agree. Completely agree. I've done so much chop and drop this year. When I was cutting back my raspberries, I would do exactly that. I would cut down the cane, and then I would actually cut the cane into smaller pieces. And so my raspberry patch is essentially mulched by the raspberry canes that I just chopped and dropped. And I do that throughout my landscape. When I'm pulling weeds, I'll pull the weed and just drop it on the ground. Or if it's a bigger weed and I have to cut it, I cut it and chop it and let it fall on the ground. You're adding organic matter. So to this point, when I've been talking about adding organic matter as an amendment, we're incorporating it into the soil. When we talk about organic matter as a mulch, it's just sitting on top of the soil. Those same insects, the same soil life is going to decompose that organic matter. It's just going to do it at the top of the soil and the bottom of the mulch. So it takes much longer than if you incorporated it into the soil, but it will break down over time. And so I look at it as being lazy as well, but it's also improving your soil with a long-term approach. All that chop and drop stuff, it's going to break down in time, and it's going to add nutrients to your soil, and it is going to be beneficial. I don't think you need to rake it all up and bag it all up. Certainly don't throw it away. You could throw it in your compost pile if you don't have enough material for your compost pile, but it's so much easier to just chop and drop. All of these beds, you can't really see because I've got them all cleaned up pretty good and raked pretty well. But as little weeds have shown up over the course of the last couple of weeks as I'm waiting to seed, I just pull that little seedling of weed, whatever it happens to be, and drop it right down on the surface. After a couple days, it shriveled up, and you can't even tell that there was a plant there. But it's really a nice approach to gardening. It is something that I definitely recommend. Greg is saying, I always worry about field bindweed rerooting, so I never chop and drop bindweed. So I used to be really worried about that. And the roots of the bindweed, absolutely. Just a smidgen of root can reroot. But the plant itself, if you cut the plant and drop it, it's not going to reroot. Don't do the roots. Pull the roots, cut off the plant, toss the roots, and save the plant for chop and drop. definitely an option. Or throw it in your compost pile. The compost pile should be enough to break down those roots and kill those roots and not have to worry about the bindweed. But I hate dealing with bindweed. You definitely don't want it rerooting if you can avoid it. And avoiding it is really about the roots being the part that are most likely to reroot. Trivid Gun is saying, thank you for all the great content, Scott. Well, you're very welcome. May the good Lord bless you and keep you and shine his countenance upon you abundantly all the days of your life. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And thank you for being here. So glad that I can be helping. Big Will Dog is saying, due to my diligence in my main raised bed this year, instead of just tomatoes, I'm growing butternut squash, I'm guessing, and peas at the same time, and they're thriving. There you go. That's what it's all about. It's diligence. It is work. You do have to build your soil over time. It's not something that happens overnight. It is doing regular amending and doing supplemental amending. And over time, this is the result. You can grow multiple things in a bed and expect all of them to thrive. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. The idea of rotating crops is one that I just really don't subscribe to for the most part. Tony O'Neill and I did a collaboration video, I think it's been probably 3 years ago now, where we talked about that. He doesn't do rotating of his crops either. The idea behind crop rotation gets back to farmers who would grow crops. They're not amending with organic matter. If you're not amending, if you're not replacing nutrients, plants are going to use up the nutrients, and different plants use different nutrients in different amounts. And so you'd have a crop that you would grow one year and it would suck up all of the nitrogen or the phosphorus or whatever. And then in the next year, you plant a different plant that uses different nutrients. And that's the idea of crop rotation, is that you're rotating your crops with an idea that they're using different nutrients in different amounts each subsequent year. If you just amend your soil so that it always has the nutrients in it, you can grow the same plants in the same bed every year. I've got my big square garden area with all the long garden beds, and I built that as my tomato and pepper garden because I can cover it with hailcloth and not worry about the weather damaging those plants. I'm growing tomatoes and peppers in the same beds. This is the third year now, or is this the fourth year? Third year. And every year I have great plants because I'm amending every fall and usually supplementing in spring, and the soil is getting even better with each subsequent year. And I posted on my Instagram a few weeks ago the mushrooms that are growing in those beds. Well, I did a video after building those beds. I filled those beds. The bottom of those beds are filled with logs and branches. The woody material in our soil is broken down by fungi. The fruit of the fungus is a mushroom. So when I see all those mushrooms growing in those beds, I'm ecstatic because it's telling me that I've got the mycelial networks, all the fungal threads that are breaking down all that wood and releasing those nutrients. So every spring when it's wet and the mushrooms pop up, I know I'm doing my job. I know that diligence is paying off. And that year is going to be a good year because the mushrooms are an indicator that there are now more nutrients available to my plants in the soil. And so don't be afraid of mushrooms. Don't be afraid of any insect or soil life that you see. By seeing that insect, that earthworm, that mushroom, it's telling you that your soil is thriving with life. And it's that life that is going to benefit the plants later on. CJ Don is saying, are there more insects that attack tomatoes? I'm finding tiny light brown bugs on the backs of the leaves. I've never seen anything like them before. Uh, there are a few, luckily, tomatoes are one of those plants that don't have a lot of attackers. Most of the problems I've had have been with the caterpillars. I occasionally will find small insects on the leaves, and they rarely cause much damage. If the plant is stressed, if it's weak for some reason, then often other insects will pop up. I've seen squash bugs on my tomato plants, but squash bugs aren't going to eat the tomatoes. I've seen potato beetles on my tomatoes, but they're not going to eat the tomatoes to really cause a problem. So the first step would be to identify. We talked about that last week with the integrated pest management. Try to identify what those brown bugs are, and that'll tell you if it's something that will attack tomatoes. But there are a lot of insects that will land on plants just to check it out and realize it's not part of their normal diet, and then they'll move on to other plants. But if you can identify it, that will definitely make a difference. Wormalus is saying, do cucumbers and tomatoes have the same general needs? Tomatoes grow fine, cucumbers struggle. They do have the same basic needs, yes. Cucumbers generally, I would say, need a little bit more water, at least early in the season. They do tend to do better early with a little higher nitrogen. Tomatoes just kind of just move along. Everything is fine. They grow at a steady pace because cucumbers grow much quicker, and you can see how fast a cucumber fruit will grow. It'll pop up as a flower, and by the end of the week, you can be harvesting that cucumber. Tomatoes takes much more time from when it's a flower to actually harvest. So because of that, the cucumbers during that early phase, especially when they're flowering and fruiting, often do take more nutrients and more water. And so if you're noticing that, this is one of those things that a soil test might help. There might be enough nitrogen and enough of those other primary nutrients for the tomatoes to grow, but it may be a little deficient for the cucumbers in the same soil. And knowing the heavy feeders, corn is like that. Corn is known as a heavy feeder. It's a grass. Grasses need nitrogen more than other plants. So that's one reason why if you're going to fertilize your lawn, you're fertilizing it with a high nitrogen fertilizer. Corn is the same way. It needs more nitrogen than other plants. So if your corn is not doing as well and all the other plants are, it could be a nitrogen deficiency for the corn. It may not be an overall deficiency for the rest of your garden. It's those plants that need more of a particular nutrient at different times of the season that you really need to focus on, and consider a supplemental fertilizer until you can get your soil to the point where it really is supporting all of the stuff that you want to support. And Esther saying, okay, I have mushrooms popping up on my wood chips. Great. In fact, I have a big pile of wood chips from last year. That's where Mala likes to lie during the evening so she can keep track of what's happening in the yard. And it's also my source when I'm adding wood chips early in the season to different beds. And as I pull away the wood chips, the inside is broken down, and it's got some of the white inside the wood chip mound. That's the mycelial, that's the fungal growth that's happening in the wood chips, and mushrooms are another indicator of it. That's the stuff I want to use. So if I'm adding wood chips to my pathways, I'll use the top of the pile. I'll add the chunky stuff that hasn't even begun to broken down, and I use that in my pathways. But when I'm adding wood chips around my fruit trees in particular, or around the raspberries, I dig into the pile and I use that stuff that's already partially decomposed. It's got some of the wood chip powder in it, and that's what I'm putting around my fruit plants, so that some of those nutrients from that wood dust that's been broken down can now flow down onto the soil and start adding the nutrients. So yeah, that's a good thing, seeing the mushrooms in the wood chip pile, but also be aware that you can use different parts of the wood chip pile for different things as far as doing the mulch in the garden. And it's not that much extra effort to just peel away the pile. If you can get really deep into the pile, you can often get to some really rich, broken down wood chips that I've done that before, where I had a pile of wood chips. Oh, this is probably 15 years ago, maybe even close to 20 years, before I knew a fraction of what I know about soil now. And I like to take before and after pictures. I also like to take pictures during the course of the growing season. And I was looking at some of the photos I had taken of that garden that year, and noticed that that big pile at the beginning of the growing season was a much smaller pile at the end of the growing season. And I hadn't used any of those chips. And so I went out, and it happened to have been a pretty wet year, and I pulled aside those wood chips, and the inside of that pile was mulch. It had been completely broken down, and it was filled with the mycelial threads, and I saw some of those mushrooms, and it was fantastic. It was dark brown, ready to be used as compost, and it had started as wood chips. So it's incredible how quickly some of that stuff can happen if it has all of the ingredients that it needs to make sure that that does happen. Cynism is saying, I had no success with cucumbers in my area until I tried them in a green stock. Today, success. Awesome. I haven't grown cucumbers in a green stock yet. I know others that do and have had success with it. So that's awesome. The nice thing about a green stock, I don't know if you're aware of this, you probably are if you're growing, but they have rings that are plant supports that you can use in your green stock. And so if you go to the green stock site and look at these plant supports, they just clip to the outside of the green stock. That's a good way to train the cucumber vines and keep them supported. So that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. That's one of those things that I haven't done yet. So it's always nice to hear what people are doing with their green stocks and what kind of success they're having. It's always something new. I'm doing some or planning to do some dwarf tomato plants in my green stock this year. So I'm still a week or two away from planting my tomatoes. Even though the soil has reached 60 degrees Fahrenheit, I like to have 70 degrees Fahrenheit for my tomatoes and peppers in particular. That's about 21 Celsius. And so I'm still waiting to put the warm season stuff in. I'll do some of the other seeds this week, but the plants, I still have another week or two before I can do that. But this week, it's finally the weather here in Colorado. You hear me talk about it all the time. It's just so crazy. So this week, for the first time, we're supposed to get our temperatures into the 80s. So it's going to be above 26 Celsius. 2 weeks ago, we had days with the high temperature of about 45 degrees, 7 degrees Celsius. 2 weeks ago, high temperature 45. This week, Wednesday, I think it is, the high temperature is going to be 85 Fahrenheit, 29 Celsius. So it's so crazy here that's why I say it's more than just the air temperature when you're looking at when to put the plants in the ground, because it's certainly warm enough for the plants to grow. But when I measure the soil temperature, because the nights have been so cool, this will be the first week. I thought it was going to be last week, and then we had some cool nights. This is the first week that I'm confident the temperatures are going to remain above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 Celsius, every night from here on out. That's another important threshold. When it hits that point, the soil can finally begin warming. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I'm still monitoring the soil temperature, but we're getting close, and it's almost time for the plants to go in the ground. Even the green stock, it is warmer. Containers do tend to warm faster, and it is warmer, but I'm still going to wait that extra couple weeks before I put my tomatoes even into the green stock. So I guess, let's see, DLR978. Let me see if I can find your original comment. Who's ultra tidy and ready for planting garden? Is that in the background? Makes me want to go there and plant something. Well, thank you. That's my garden. And I do appreciate that. I saw that because I saw that Jay in particular had said that that is my garden. And yes, they are ready for planting. That's why I'm talking about monitoring the soil temperature so that I can be ready to put something in the ground. And I'm really proud. So this is a good indication of the soil. So this back corner bed that I have is where my garlic is growing. That was the very first bed I put in 4.5 years ago. It's had all of that time with amendments, and the garlic is almost 2 feet tall. It's beautiful in that bed. That bed has the best soil in my entire garden because it was the very first bed that I built and the very first bed that I filled with soil. So it stands to reason that it's going to have the best soil. I can see that with just how strong the garlic is growing. I almost always have great garlic crops. This year, the plants are stronger than I've ever had. And a big part of that is the soil because that's the richest soil I have. And the garlic is growing so great. The other beds are close behind. I've got a couple beds that have had the soil for about 3.5 years, and some of these other newer beds are closer to 3 years. But even then, every year I have a great garden. This year I'm expecting it, like I said before, to be better because the soil is just doing so much better because it's had so much more time to become healthy. And the garlic is the indicator that, yes, indeed, it's working. It's absolutely working. And I thank you for saying that, DLR, because uh, it's one of those things that, and I know that many of you live in Colorado or live in environments similar to mine, and we will watch videos on YouTube. So many people on YouTube are in San Diego, in Texas, in areas where the weather is so much warmer and you can grow plants almost year round. And so they've got their videos coming out in February of their beautiful plants and what they're doing. And it takes much longer for those of us at high altitude or in the north where we have to wait to get our garden going. And so I love how my garden is looking right now because a month ago, everything was brown. These beds were certainly not ready for planting. It's all about that time. The patience within gardening really makes all the difference. And so over the course of the season, of course, I'll be putting updates of my garden. And so kind of think about this picture today, these bare beds. And here in a few months, you'll be seeing all the plants that are growing in these beds. And all of us can do it. That's why I wanted to talk about this today. You just have to be aware of it. And it has to be part of your gardening diligence. It needs to be a job, a chore that you have to do on a regular basis. But once you do, oh, you have fantastic looking plants and you don't have to fertilize. A strong plant fights pests. I read an article, I think I may have mentioned this before. I'm not sure, I forget what book it's from, but the author, uh, after having either done research or reviewed research, I forget exactly, but says that a healthy plant cannot be attacked by insects. It's the weak plant that is attacked by insects. And so when a plant is strong and healthy and thriving, it has natural defenses against insects. When a plant is weak, it has natural defenses, but it also is susceptible to insect damage. And insects know the diseased and the damaged plants, And those are the ones that they're going to attack. And the plant next door to it isn't going to be attacked at all because it's strong and healthy. The soil makes all the difference in the world in making a plant healthy. Serena's asking when I am growing in my green stock. So I did a video a few weeks ago. One of my green stocks, I've got flowers growing and they're doing fantastic. They're looking amazing. I've got strawberries in the green stock in my greenhouse, and I've been harvesting strawberries every day. I didn't harvest this morning because my daughter and granddaughters are visiting my garden this afternoon. And so they get to pick the strawberries in the greenhouse that are growing in the green stock. And then the other two green stocks, I have spinach and kale and lettuce and I think I got some beans and some peas and some radishes that are all growing. A lot of salad kind of crops that are growing. And I just seeded those recently because the weather just hasn't been good enough for me to get growing. But I think I've got between all the different green stocks, at least 30 or 40 different types of plants that are growing. So that's one of the nice things about all those different pockets in the green stock is it's like having that many different containers. And so in my 6-tier green stock with 6 cells in each tier, that's 36 individual little pots. And it's like having 36 pots lined up on my deck, but instead I've got 36 that are in a tower, and the same with the one next to it and the same with the one next to it. So lots of different plants, and I'll be changing them out as I harvest over the course of the season as well. Thank you, Jay. There's that video about planting flowers in the green stock. They're just looking great. I'll be taking a picture for my Gardener's Guide Instagram page here pretty soon, and just to show the update because it is so nice. Bowtie Life in the Garden says, I had 8 guests in the garden yesterday afternoon picking blueberries, blackberries, and just looking around. It's fun having visitors, eh? Oh, absolutely. I love having the visitors in the garden of all types. The nice thing about my garden club, if you happen to live around Falcon, Colorado, look into joining the Falcon Garden Club because we have garden tours in August. And last year was the first year we did it. And my garden was on the tour. This year I'll be doing it again. And I love having 30, 40 people in my garden and just talking gardening. It's a wonderful thing. I love having visitors in the garden. So it is one of those things. Even if you don't think your garden is good enough for people to see, it is. When we did the garden tour last year, we had 6, might have been 7 different gardeners showing off their gardens, and they were all different. They were in all different stages of development. Some might not have been pretty because they were still being grown, but they were still beautiful. I think all gardens are beautiful. So invite people into your garden and be proud of what you have. I think that's just a fantastic opportunity if you can get somebody into your garden. Shout out to Sean. Thank you for gifting a Gardener Scott membership. I do appreciate that. The membership on the Gardener Scott channel is an option. I've got a link in the description below if you're interested in becoming a member. There are perks, like I mentioned at the beginning, at the training and collaborator level today. After this video here in just a few minutes, we'll be having a members only live stream, and it's much more personal, much smaller group. All the questions are answered. And so it's really a good opportunity for us to get together. And so thank you for gifting that because I think that is nice. This last weekend, we had the Falcon Garden Club plant sale, and it was wonderful. All of us had grown plants. We had hundreds of plants and sell at a bargain. I was selling tomato plants for $2. It is such a great way to do things like that, to meet new gardeners, to just talk. I talked gardening all afternoon. It was fantastic. But I want to give a shout out to a few people because I would say to you, if you see me on the street or wherever it happens to be, stop and say hello. Anytime you see a fellow gardener, stop. You can talk about gardening. It doesn't need to be more than just a couple minutes, but do that. And my week began by meeting Rita, lovely Rita. I was at my garden center getting some supplies, and Rita came up, and it usually starts the same way. Are you Gardener Scott? And of course, I said I was, and she figured it was either me or I had a twin that happened to be at the garden center. And it was lovely chatting with Rita for a few minutes while we were waiting in line and getting ready for both of us to go into our gardens that day. So shout out to Rita if you happen to be listening today. And then at the plant sale this weekend, two others. So a shout out to Cheryl, and Cheryl and I, same type of thing. She watches the videos, and we had a nice chat while we were standing there amongst the beautiful weather that we had over the weekend. And then Sean as well. And Sean actually joined the Falcon Garden Club. So I'm looking forward to seeing him on the garden tour and in all of our meetings over the course of the months ahead. So thank you to Rita and Cheryl and Sean for taking time out of your day to say hello to me and to give me the opportunity to meet you and talk gardening, because you probably figured out I like to talk about gardening, and I will do it until there comes a time that I have to stop. And we reach that time. But I do want to say hello and thank you to Sim. Your site is full of fun and interesting people. Thank you so much. I completely agree. I love the people. I love the Gardener Scott community. It is just so wonderful. You all are fantastic. And thank you for that contribution. I do appreciate it. It does help keep the channel going and definitely helps in the garden. And shout out to Shannon McGinnis, a new member of the Gardener Scott community. So look forward to this time. I look forward to all the time that we can have together, even if it's just a comment you make on my video. I see it. I recognize it. I try to answer it if it's a question. And I recognize many of the names that come back with multiple comments and multiple questions, and I appreciate it so, so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. I hope the weather is good for you. We've had crazy weather here in the United States. I hope it is good for you as we move into this week ahead. And let's come back next week, same time, same channel, and we'll get our week started with more gardening talk. I'm Gardener Scott. Always enjoy gardening.